All right, and so I'm going to be introducing Dr. Ken Hammond, who's going to be speaking with us today, and then Dr. Rockhill is going to talk a little bit about some of our co-sponsors. Dr. Hammond received his PhD from Harvard University in History and East Asian Languages in 1994. He has taught at New Mexico State University ever since. Specializes in the history of China in the early modern period, especially the 16th century. He's published numerous articles on Chinese intellectual and political history, and his book, Pepper Mountain, The Life, Death, and Posthumous Career of Yang Zhixing, 1516 to 1555, came out in 2007. In 1919, Dr. Hammond was a research fellow at the Institute of History at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in Beijing. In 2002 and 2003, he was a visiting fellow at the International Institute for Asian Studies in Leiden, the Netherlands. From 2007 to 2015, he was co-director of the Confucius Institute at New Mexico State. And since 2017, he has been affiliated with the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin. What an international career he has had. He's been a lecturer for the National Geographic Society and for the Smithsonian Institution in China, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia. And he has a new book coming out in a matter of weeks or months, China's Revolution and the Quest for a Socialist Future. So before he begins, I was just going to let Dr. Rockhill say a few things about our other co-sponsors, which I really appreciate.
I'm going to be really quick. Thank you all for coming. I think it's a really important topic. Dr. Hammond is one of the kind of Anglophone specialists on contemporary China. There are lots of questions that people are asking about China, and so it's a real pleasure and honor to have him here to share his work with us. I do have information about Dr. Hammond is also going to be at the Liberation Center, which is an activist hub in North Philadelphia this Saturday. So I have some flyers about that. I'll circulate them. If you already know about it, then just hand the flyers on. Otherwise, please take one. I also have some documentation about the Liberation Center itself if people are interested in knowing more about the activities that are going on there. So I'll do the same. Otherwise, it's an honor to collaborate with, I direct the Critical Theory Workshop, which is an alternative education platform. And so it's an honor to collaborate with Cultural Studies, and thank you to Karen Hollis for having made this event possible. I'll close the door, and otherwise I'll turn it over to Ken.
Yeah. Okay. Welcome to Villanova.
Okay, you should never applaud before you hear what somebody has to say. But it's not coming from someone who's pissed off more than a few audiences. But yeah, I'm very happy to be here. I've been in Philadelphia from time to time over the years, but this is actually my first visit to Villanova, so glad to be here. I got a little swept away with the term critical theory workshop, or whatever he just said, and the cultural studies idea. So what I want to talk about today is kind of about theorizing. You know, how we can think about both the way, at least some people in positions of importance in China think about what they're doing, and also how we might think a little bit about what they're doing. Saturday at the Liberation Center, we'll certainly also talk about that a little bit, but focus a little more maybe on some of the particularities of the current moment. But they all fit together, so as you'll see, we can touch on all that stuff today as well. So what I want to talk about, and this is an article I'm working on, is called Theorizing with Chinese Characteristics, because that's a phrase that we hear all the time coming out from China. When Xi Jinping gave his report to the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of China last November, he started out talking about how what's going on there is what he calls socialism with Chinese characteristics for the new era, which packs a lot into a short phrase. And what I want to do is at least unpack some of that today. So when we think about this idea of socialism with Chinese characteristics, what does with Chinese characteristics mean, and why bother to say that? It's, you know, if it's socialism, don't we know what that is, and isn't that just a pretty straightforward thing? But that, of course, gets into all kinds of questions about how socialism is theorized itself, how it comes into actual practice, how people go about trying to create socialist societies, successes, failures, all that. There's massive amounts of things we can say about all that. But when we think about China's particular experience of this, it has followed a complex, sometimes convoluted, and always dialectical process of development. And so, as a historian, you know, always have to drop back and build up to the present moment a little bit. And the place that I want to start that process here is with the founding of the Communist Party of China in 1921. China had, you know, been an imperial system for millennia. The old dynastic state is overthrown in 1911, 1912. Efforts are made to try to create a republic, a more modern, perhaps liberal democratic type of state in the teens. That falters in the context of exploitation of China by Western imperialism, and inflected by the example of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917, many people in China began to look for alternatives, and especially after what was widely perceived as the betrayal of China by the Western liberal democracies at the Versailles Peace Conference in 1919, when concessions were made to the rising Japanese imperialism in China, and Chinese felt very betrayed by the United States and Britain and France. Many people began to look for perhaps other paths than simply following the Western liberal democratic example. And as part of that, and increasingly the central focus of that, there was an engagement with Marxism. People began to read Marxist texts in translation. People began to have reading groups come together in different parts of China, in Beijing, in Shanghai, Changsha, different cities around the country. And at that same time, what's called the Communist International, or the Third International, an organization that was established in Moscow after the Bolshevik Revolution to promote and coordinate revolutionary activities in countries around the world, took a big interest in China. China, you know, it's a big country, a lot of people, long history, etc., so not surprising that that the International would be interested in that area of activity as well. Those things come together by the summer of 1921 in the formation of the Communist Party of China, which obviously just celebrated its centenary a couple of years ago. The big question, of course, for any revolutionary organization coming together is, where do we go from there? You know, fine, we have a founding Congress, we have a party, we have some members. What do you do? How are we going to pursue this process of revolution? How are we going to advance the cause of socialism in our country, in that country? And it's at that point that contradictions begin to emerge, because there were certainly discrepancies, or divergences, shall we say, between what we might think of as classical Marxist thought and the realities of China. Okay? Marxism, of course, is a materialist system of thought. Historical materialism, dialectical materialism, however you want to think of it or phrase it. And that means that it has to be grounded in actually existing conditions. It's not just a theoretical schematic that you can apply universally without any modification or adaptation, or at least that's how many of us think of it. But when we get to a country like China, the applicability or the transferability of classical Marxist ideas into the material conditions of China, especially in the 1920s, posed some challenges. And those challenges arose from a number of sources. One was simply some problems in Marx's own thought, in Marx's own writing, and in other writers in that tradition in the later 19th, early 20th century, in thinking about parts of the world outside of Europe. Marx wrote his major works, especially Capital, really based upon the historical experience of the rise of capitalism in Europe, and particularly in England, which was, you know, a very clear and straightforward case, and it generated tremendous insights which remain invaluable to revolutionary movements today. But knowledge about China, especially China's historical traditions, was pretty minimal in Europe in the 19th century. And so there came to be a view of China and Asia more broadly, and indeed of the non-European world fairly broadly, as having been backward, stagnant, primitive, etc., various terms like this. In other words, non-capitalist, pre-capitalist, pre-modern, things like that. And ideas which were developed out of the historical experience of Europe, his stages of historical progression, the idea that society moves from sort of primitive communism to classical slave societies, and then feudalism, and then capitalism arises out of feudalism. That template tended to get applied to non-Western societies without a lot of close fine-tuning of the data, shall we say. And that meant that as Chinese people read Marxist works or the writings of Lenin, they saw a narrative which they tried then to assimilate to their own social circumstances, their own historical society. And the International, which was providing advice, guidance, and material assistance in the formation of the party and the launching of the revolutionary project, was itself dominated by a kind of, by that point, orthodox interpretation of historical materialism, which saw China through a lens that had been crafted in Europe. So it's a perception of China that led to certain political decisions. Most particularly, the idea was that in China, the industrial working class was a very small proportion of the population. And that's certainly true. Most of the factory production in China in those days was located in Shanghai or a few other locations along the East Coast. As a percentage of the population or the working population, the industrial proletariat was a tiny fraction, and China was an overwhelmingly agrarian economy. And the view was that in that situation, it didn't make sense for a communist party to put itself forward as the revolutionary vanguard, because there simply wasn't a working class, a proletariat, for them to lead. You know, you could lead this little group, but it wasn't going to really be enough to transform Chinese society. And so another group called the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, was seen as the representative of sort of a national bourgeoisie, a national commercial business elite, which was opposed to Western imperialism because they wanted to be free to pursue their own economic interests. And so seeing the Kuomintang, seeing the national bourgeoisie as an anti-imperialist formation, led the representatives of the International and the emerging leaders of the Communist Party to decide that they should form an alliance. And we get what's called the First United Front. That persists for about 4 years, from 1923 to 27. It's a rocky arrangement for a while, and eventually there's a split between the nationalists and the communists. Many communists are killed and arrested, and the party faces very, very serious setbacks, which leads to a period of what I sometimes think of as kind of wandering in the wilderness between about 1927 and say 1934, 35, as the party tries to come to grips with how do you make a revolution, a socialist revolution, a socialist modern revolution in this set of conditions that they face in China. Two factors complicate that narrative. One in China and one amongst the Marxists outside of China, shall we say, particularly the Bolsheviks in Russia. Within China, the complicating factor is Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong he was one of the people who was at the first founding Congress of the party back in 21. When the United Front was established, he, like other members of the Communist Party, joined the Nationalist Party, and in that context rose to be director of what's called the Peasant Bureau, working in the countryside, organizing farmers' unions and things like that, particularly in sort of southwestern China, especially Hunan province, which is where he was from. And Mao began to analyze Chinese society in ways that diverged from classical Marxism. Marx very famously considered the French peasantry, for example, as having all the, I think the way he put it was it had all the political cohesion of a sack of potatoes. That it was not a reliable class force, that the peasantry was basically a petty bourgeois strata, which was volatile. They could, in certain circumstances, align their interests with the working class, but they could just as easily align their interests with the bourgeoisie. So Marx was not enamored of the peasantry as a revolutionary strata, at least in the context of Western Europe. But when Mao looked at China and analyzed Chinese society and thought about the real nature of the Chinese economy, he reconceptualized, or he thought differently, about many of the peasantry, not all of them, but the vast majority of the peasantry, and he considered them actually to be what he called agricultural proletarians. Okay? And as such, they constituted a natural alliance for the industrial proletariat. The industrial proletariat was still very tiny, but the agricultural proletariat was immense. It was the majority of the farming population in the country. And there were different conditions in different parts of the country. We don't have time to get into all the details of the agricultural economy at that point. But this different view of the peasantry, which he articulates in an article in 1926, his report on the peasant movement in Hunan, says that this is the force that's going to make the revolution in China. And as the Communist Party, we can either get with the program or stand on the sidelines and criticize it, or get in front and try to stop it, but that would be foolish. So this is the reality of China, and this is what we should be paying attention to. At the same time, in the mid-1920s, 1925, 26, 27, debates were taking place amongst the Bolsheviks in Russia about the nature of China, about how China should be thought of, how it should be conceptualized. This was in this context of trying to figure out a path forward. Very interesting figure, a fellow named Karl Radek, who was the chancellor of something called the University for the Toilers of the East in Moscow. Did a lot of study about China. He didn't actually read Chinese himself, but he read a lot of scholarship, critical scholarship about Chinese economic history. And he came to conclude that the interpretation of China as sort of this morass of feudalism was wrong. And that indeed both manufacturing and agriculture had been commercialized and essentially operated as a distinctive form of capitalism for many, many centuries in China. And that without appreciating that and sort of incorporating that perspective, it was impossible to understand the class realities of China at the point in time of the mid-1920s. So Mao and Radek had no knowledge of each other particularly. Mao was not yet a prominent enough figure in the movement in China. Radek was a somewhat marginal figure. He played an important role in European politics, but as far as leadership in the party, in the Soviet Party, it was not certainly at the top ranks. So there's no interaction between these perspectives, but they both suggest that there were alternative ways of understanding things as early as the mid-1920s. When we get to the 1930s, things begin to change very quickly in China, and this is where we can start talking about with Chinese characteristics, because In 1935, January of 1935, during what's called the Long March, which was a retreat, a defeat of the party and the Red Army by the nationalists that caused a huge, about 120,000 people to flee the southern part of China and over a year literally walk thousands of miles off to the northwest, where they came to a new, what was called a revolutionary base area, the area around a town called Yenan in northern China. And at the very beginning of that process, in January 35, in a little town called Zunyi in the southwest, the political leadership of the party finally embraced Mao Zedong's perspective. They criticized and self-criticized the policies of trying to promote the proletariat, the industrial proletariat, as the vanguard and trying to find these compromises with the bourgeoisie and the nationalists and everything. And they said, you know what, Mao Zedong, he's got something going here. We really need to rethink our relationship with the peasantry or the agricultural proletariat. And that is what launches the CPC on what becomes its successful path of revolutionary struggle. Once they arrive in Yenan, Mao sets about writing what we can really think of as the first sort of theoretical works of Marxism with Chinese characteristics, particularly a couple of essays, one called On Contradiction and another called On Practice. He writes these about 1937. And in these, he uses, there's this phrase that is used to describe them, he takes what they call the universal or general truths of Marxism-Leninism and tries to apply and adapt them to the material conditions of China. So they're not, I mean, these are not the most brilliant critical theoretical works ever written, but they are a very, very clear and strong effort to think about China, to think about the process of revolutionary change, to think about dialectical materialism, the way of understanding the operations of the world, and lining those up more directly and more in a more applied way to the real existing conditions in China. He also, in the early 1940s, engages in a series of talks at what was called the Yenan Forum on Art and Literature, in which he thinks about issues of culture. And there's a within Marxism, there's this complex relationship of what they call the base and the superstructure, the idea that the material conditions in which people live their lives, the subjective experience of living in a market or capitalist economy, shape the way that we conceptualize larger relationships, larger processes, our basic understanding of the nature and function of the world around us. And so the relationship between socialist revolution and cultural transformation is a very intimate one, and Mao explores that in ways that not only try to adapt Marxist theory to Chinese realities, but also have to interact with China's own historical culture, its own historical traditions. Because, again, you can't just take Marxism as some template and just plug it in. You have to make it work with the actual circumstances in which you find yourself. So these essays, this movement in the 30s, he's adapting on an intellectual level precepts of Marxism to realities of the Chinese struggle. Struggle, of course, goes on. They have to fight a war with the Japanese from 1937 to 45. Then there's the Civil War between the nationalists and the communists from 45 to 49. 1949, October of 49, the People's Republic is established. This is what's called the moment of liberation. And they set about the project of building a new China, a socialist China, a China which will at some point in the future become a socialist economy and society. And that leads to some further twists and turns along the path, because now Marxism becomes, it's the ideology, it's the interpretive model, which is embraced by the powers that be, the new rulers, the new leaders in China, by the Communist Party and the government of the People's Republic. And so lots of intellectual activity begins to take place. And this leads to some interesting debates also about the nature of Chinese society and the Chinese economy. They come up with some fascinating concepts, trying to work within this sort of Marxist, still powerful Marxist orthodoxy of stages of development and the necessary processes of history, but grappling with what they actually see in the historical record of China. So they come up, for example, with a term I've always loved, which is the sprouts of capitalism. Marxist orthodoxy wouldn't allow one to say that China in the Song dynasty or the Ming dynasty or the Qing dynasty had been a capitalist economy. But it was undeniable that it was a market economy, an economy of commodity production, say that fast, and that, you know, all these features that we associate with capitalism in Europe were also present in China: division of labor, monetization, banking and finance, all these various things. But it couldn't be called capitalism, so instead it was the sprouts of capitalism, because capitalism could only arise in China in the modern period, after the revolution, after going through this process of transformation, on the way to building socialism. So that wasn't exactly a successful adaptation. And in fact, a few years ago, I was in a conversation with a director of the Historical Institute of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and I said, "Whatever happened to the sprouts of capitalism?" And she said, "Oh, we don't say sprouts of capitalism anymore. Now we say early modernity." Right?
Wow.
So just have to make the words fit your moment, I guess. China went through further processes of trying to come to grips with its historical culture, the great proletarian cultural revolution, which we could spend days on all by itself, the not very well understood, even by many Chinese, campaign to criticize Lin Biao and Confucius in the early 70s. A lot of efforts to figure out what the relationship was or should be between this project of building a socialist future and the legacies of the past, which continue. A revolution, although it can happen in dramatic time frames, it's not like flipping a light switch. Socialism doesn't just appear. A socialist consciousness doesn't just appear. It's something that takes a long time to emerge from the actual transformation of material conditions. So these were struggles. Some successes, some failures, some victories, some challenges. Moving forward. Mao Zedong dies in 1976, and within just a few years, China's policies, China's economic development policies, undergo some fairly serious transformations. That transition involves an assessment by the party of the legacy of Mao. There's a lot in there, but basically, it says he did a lot of good things and he did a few not so good things, and overall we wouldn't be here without him. But there's no doubt that the successes, the main contributions of Mao Zedong to the Chinese Revolution were exactly in his adaptation, his refitting of what we can think of as the fundamentals of dialectical and historical materialism, the application of those to the realities of Chinese history and culture, and what we might think of as adapting the idioms of Marxism, the methodology, the terminology, adapting that to Chinese realities as well. Okay, so there's a big change, reorientation, if you will, beginning in 1978, 79, which has unfolded all the way down to the present day, and that's what we call the era of reform and opening to the outside. There's lots that goes on in that, and we're not going to have time to go into all those details here, but the basic idea of the reform period has been to use the mechanisms of the market to develop the productive forces of the economy. 1979 or 1976, at the end of the period where Mao had been the leading figure in China, China had achieved great things. They had, after 49, stabilized the country, carried out land reform, developed agricultural production, gone a long way down the path of industrialization. They'd raised material standards of living for hundreds of millions of people, improved life expectancy, lowered infant mortality, developed a national health care system, developed an educational system, built housing. They'd done tremendous things, but 1979, China was still a very poor country. They had achieved an egalitarianism of poverty, but that's not what socialism is. Socialism is a situation of economic prosperity, of economic abundance, from each according to their ability to each according to their work. And communism, beyond that, from each according to their ability to each according to their need. China was nowhere near that. Nowhere near that. And the new leadership, centered around a gentleman named Deng Xiaoping, resolved that drastic measures were needed and launched what we can only think of as a great experiment, and one which is still playing out today, using market mechanisms to develop the productive economy. That involved, in the 1980s, a great economic debate, which is really kind of the most recent place where we can really see this idea of socialism with Chinese characteristics playing itself out. There's a wonderful book on this by an economist up at UMass Amherst called Isabella Weber, and the book's called How China Escaped Shock Therapy. Right? And she does a really good job of not just tracing out the debates in the 1980s, but showing the roots of the intellectual positions that were taken in those debates. And when you get down to that level of analysis, what becomes immediately apparent is that the thinking of the Chinese leadership, and not that it's monolithic, these were very, very serious, very, very sharp debates. But the thinking of the leadership in China, and of many Chinese intellectuals and political activists, people throughout Chinese society, really is a dialectical interaction of sort of classical Marxist theory and drawing on the historical experience of China. Because in these debates, people are certainly citing Marx, citing Lenin, different economists from the modern period, but they're also citing figures like Guanzhou, who was a 6th century BCE economic advisor to one of the rulers of one of the little states that populated China in those days. Mencius, who was one of the followers, interpreters of Confucius, who wrote a lot about what we might think of in modern terminology as political ecology, what the interplay between the state and the economy should be. Something called the Salt and Iron Debate from around 80 BCE, which was a debate upon the role of the state in monopolies, to what extent should the state intervene in the activities of private commercial actors, things like that. They're drawing on these, and they're drawing on the history of imperial policy. Things like what were called the ever-normal granaries, which was a system designed to buffer the worst effects of the market. Certainly by the time you get down to the Song Dynasty, which starts in 960, China had a very highly developed commercial economy. What some of us, myself included, are thinking of as really a capitalist economy. And of course, markets are not forces of social justice or equality. It's not the best result for the greatest number. It's everybody getting in there and fighting for their piece. Markets tend to generate inequality and differential allocation of wealth. The state has to decide what its relationship with that process is going to be. And when we look at imperial policy over the last 1,000 years, one of the key features was these things called ever-normal granaries. And the idea was that when there were abundant harvests, when there was a lot of grain in the marketplace, prices, of course, would fall. So the state would buy up grain and store it away. And then in times where grain was scarce and prices therefore were high, they would release reserves into the market to contain prices within a certain acceptable range. Buying when it was cheap, selling when it was dear. Not setting prices, not a command structure, but buffering the worst effects of market fluctuations. Other kinds of examples, the operation of monopolies in certain areas, these debates on salt and iron that I mentioned, a few other commodities over the span of history, things that were considered so essential to the livelihood of people that they should not be vulnerable to the extraction of excess profits on the part of private capital or private interests. So there's a history that was not, as I say, very well understood by the writers like Marx or Lenin, but which now we know a lot more about. And now we can understand and appreciate the complexities of the historical process in China and see that when we look at the market economy in China today, what it gets called different things, the socialist market economy, socialism with Chinese characteristics, again, these different terms get applied. What we can see is that you can draw on Western theory, on Marxist theory, and that's certainly very, very valuable. And you can draw on both theoretical and practical knowledge from China's own domestic traditions. So when Xi Jinping, who has been the top leader since about 2012, 2013, Xi Jinping talks a lot about what he calls fulfilling the original mission of the revolution, improving the livelihood of the people, building a socialist future, developing an economy that is more just and equitable, where the fruits of the labor of working people are more distributed according to that labor, rather than being siphoned off for the profitability of private capital. China today, very complex economy, very complex terrain. There is private capital, chunks of private capital, big chunks of private capital, and that's a challenge. The theory is that by maintaining the leading role, the guiding role of the party, the worst effects of the markets, the worst effects of the development of the economy in those parts that are in the private hands can be buffered and constrained. And we've certainly seen in recent years examples of that. Ways in which the socialist infrastructure of China continues to pursue that project of a better life for the Chinese people. Buffering, for example, the 2008 financial crisis, ensuring that the 20 million people who lost their jobs because of the collapse of demand by Western consumers for Chinese export goods weren't just dumped on the street, but were taken care of by a socialist infrastructure. We can go into that in more detail if people want to. The way that when the COVID pandemic struck, China's social resources, not just the state, but society, mobilized to take care of people, so that China lost fewer than 6,000 people, while we lost well over 1 million, with a quarter of their population. The reining in of figures like Jack Ma and his Alibaba group that are big and influential players, but can't try to dominate the state the way that a bourgeois class would. So I remain in the cautiously optimistic camp when viewing China. And I think that when we think about this idea of Marxism or socialism with Chinese characteristics, that if we take what the Chinese say about themselves, how they see themselves, how they think of what they're doing, this project of of development, this project of moving forward, trying to build what Xi Jinping calls an ecological civilization. And we should note that China is the leading country in the world in terms of trying to come to grips with the climate crisis. More alternative energy, more investment in research and development than any other country in the world as a proportion of their energy consumption and what they're looking to for the future. These are all challenges. China faces lots of major challenges today: corruption, inequality, environmental stresses beyond just global warming. But these are all things that they're trying to address and move forward on. Will they be successful in those endeavors? You know, we'll have to wait and see. There's no guarantees in history or in life. But I think that when we look at their historical experience, the lessons, the knowledge that they have to draw on of how to manage a commercial market economy, how to constrain the worst abuses that arise in the course of capital's operations, and have the ability not just as sort of theoreticians on the sidelines, but from occupying the central nodes of power in the Communist Party and in the government of the People's Republic, that the project of using the market to develop the productive economy, with the goal being the attainment of a socialist future, is one that deserves to be encouraged and supported. Thank you.
Now we can applaud.
That's up to you.
All right.
And of course, I'm happy to take questions, because you're stuck with me for another 20 minutes or something.
Let's have some questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you said that like poverty isn't socialism, right? But isn't the current day Chinese society of such mass inequality, of the running dogs of the bourgeoisie, both in party and in government and in the society-wide, even less socialism?
Good question. And given the neutrality of your phrasing, I'm sure that you have your own perspective on this. That is, I mean, this is the challenge. This is the question. You know, let's cut to the chase. Inequality in China has exploded since the embrace of the market reforms. There's no question about that. At the same time, there's been a lot of other problems that have been engendered by the reforms. As I said, you know, it's not just inequality, but it's corruption, people in the party and the state abusing their positions of power to enrich themselves. It has been the emergence of you know, bourgeois elements in the society, and of course the environmental stresses and all of that. Is China less socialist now than it was in, let's say, 1978? Probably so. Probably so. But what is its path? What is its trajectory? And, you know, how can we, I mean, we're all, you're not, but the rest of us primarily are outsiders to the process. How can we think of it? How can we maybe inflect it in some way? And I think that this venture is a dangerous one. It is and it's, as I say, it's not a done deal. It's not a resolved situation. There are bourgeois elements that would certainly love to dominate the state and all that. And you have the question, you know, under Jiang Zemin, this idea of admitting capitalists into the Communist Party. I mean, you know, the rationale is it's better to have them inside the tent pissing out than outside the tent pissing in. But whether or not that's entirely correct, I think, you know, that's a challenging thing. You know, my view, obviously, as I've said, is that this is a work in progress, and that at least in the present period, Xi Jinping seems to be dedicated to a reinvigoration of Marxism, not without its own flaws and challenges. I know that there are still tensions and contradictions, especially amongst young people who take the revolution seriously, which is fabulous. But I think that both in the global context, where China is increasingly the target of Western imperialism, and at home, this is a project that, from my point of view, as best as I can understand it, and I've lived and worked in China for 42 years now. I think my view is that it's still the project that we have to try to advance. I suspect we disagree, but there you
What
are.
I would say is but just from the daily observation, I can see during the COVID, people are starving, and the inflation is it's skyrocketing, going directly to the space, or even landing on the moon or something, or I can tell that people are wondering about what this party is all about.
Sure.
And also the new document published by the Chinese government saying their main ideas. They remove Mao Zedong's thought. They remove Deng Xiaoping theory. They remove the three representative theory. What they only remain is Xi Jinping, the new era, I don't know, some glorious stuff that is super long.
Mm-hmm.
I disagree on that they are still on the socialist path. From my understanding that they are using red or Marxism as a mask and disguising their essence of being a Kuomintang, of being a bourgeoisie party.
Okay. Obviously, we're going to disagree on that. But I take your points. Okay? This fella from back here. Yeah.
I wondered whether you could comment on the international aspects, in particular the Belt and Road Initiative and international institutions that China's been setting up, such as the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. The Belt and Road Initiative seems to be sort of tied to the old Silk Road, which would seem to tie into the period before the Communist Party, and yet it's still being elevated by it.
Well, I mean, the Silk Road, that's historically the Silk Road, or Silk Roads, really, simply was an indication of the position that China's economy held within global, or really Eurasian exchange. I mean, I think that gets invoked, as the overland routes, certainly the rail routes that go, you can go from Shanghai to Paris now by train again. That gets, the Silk Road gets invoked, for its metaphorical familiarity or something. But the Belt and Road Initiative in general, again, this is a topic that there's a lot of debate and discussion about, and I think often there's a entirely understandable cynicism about things like development loans and all that. Largely based upon our own experience in this country that. The United States, the IMF, the World Bank, there's not a great track record there in terms of having money go into developing countries, poor countries, and really wind up just enriching the lenders more than the target countries. I think a lot of the coverage, especially, one of the big areas that we hear a lot about is the whole China in Africa routine, And again, there's no question that there's contradictions and tensions that evolve in the course of this. There's been tension and friction between Chinese people going into African countries, not just African countries. That again, there's historical continuity there as well, and not so much in Africa, but in Southeast Asia. I think some interesting notes on the international or the Belt and Road kind of stuff. China just forgave, I think, $80 billion in short-term debt because of the effects of the pandemic for the most part. It also has just extended, I don't have the figure off the top of my head, but it's like another $180 billion in what's called emergency financing for countries that have run into problems, repaying their indebtedness. Not totally forgiving that portion, but, extending terms to allow things to be covered. In Africa, I know that there's just been a report about infrastructure development, and I think it's important that that a lot of what China invests in and has invested in is just that, is in infrastructure development, 6,000 kilometers of roadways and 6,000 kilometers of railways and this and that and the other thing. The Belt and Road Initiative is not a charity foundation, right? And I think that we need to bear that in mind. China's not investing in these development situations out of the goodness of its heart, or as some sort of a grant program or giveaway. Their goal is, as they say, is mutually beneficial, right? Which means that there's going to be benefits to China, right? And I don't think there's any question of that trade and exchange is just that. Things flow both ways. So I think the real question in the long term, but also in the short term, is whether we see the kinds of political domination of countries that are recipients of investment and assistance from China that we tend to see when the IMF imposes austerity programs, or what do they call it, restructuring, things like that. And as far as I can tell, the Chinese don't do that. Now, they get criticized for that because they're said to, what's the phrase they like, to be coddling dictators or something like that, because they do not impose political conditions on assistance that they provide. The idea being that if these economies develop and conditions improve, then maybe things will move in different directions politically as well. I don't know if that's naive or maybe even cynical. I certainly hope not. But the reality is that they do not impose political conditions on their international assistance. The Belt and Road Initiative doesn't require countries to reconfigure themselves economically or politically. So I think that it's very different from what has been the experience of many countries with aid from the West. And I think that's reflected in the way that the United States right now is kind of scrambling to at least rhetorically, recommit itself to parts of the world that it has been ignoring since the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Pacific, the islands in the Pacific, a lot of countries in Africa, where the U.S. was engaged back in the 50s and 60s in a competition with the Soviet Union. But once that competition went away, so did the concern for those countries. And I think that the idea that we're suddenly interested again reflects this sort of new Cold War mentality that has taken hold. And maybe from the perspective of some of these countries, they'll think of it as a good thing because they can play two competitors off against one another. But I just think that the things like the Belt and Road Initiative are functioning in a way that's very different from sort of the Western, the classical Western model. Over here, yeah.
What's your opinion on the situation with Taiwan? Do you view them as being likely to have conflict within the next decade or so? How do you think that President Xi is going to reconcile that issue without causing a huge global conflict over that?
Well, my position on Taiwan is actually the same as the position of the government of the United States, which is that everybody on both sides of the strait understands that Taiwan is part of China. There are some disagreements as to who constitutes the government of the country, but if you go to Taipei and you go to a bookstore and buy a map of what they think of as their country, it's the whole place. the position that the Chinese government has maintained, and that Xi Jinping has reiterated many, many times, is that this is it's a situation that has come down from history, as they say, because of course the differential situation between the mainland and the island is the result of the outcome of the Civil War back in 1948-49, when the nationalists withdrew to Taiwan. Again, in emulation of earlier historical examples after the fall of the Ming Dynasty. But it's a situation that comes down from history and which needs to be resolved by the Chinese people on both sides of the strait in their own way and in their own time, without the interference of outside forces. Obviously, there are significant differences of opinion in Taiwan about how to proceed. Right now, the previous president of Taiwan, a fellow named Ma Ying-jeou, is on the mainland, just made a visit to Nanjing. He's going to visit his sort of ancestral homeland, home province and town, as a gesture on the part of the party that he's associated with, the Kuomintang Party, the Nationalist Party, of reconciliation and a recognition that people on both sides of the strait, not everybody on both sides of the strait, but people on both sides of the strait are all Chinese. The government, which is located in Taipei, calls itself the Republic of China. The National Palace Museum in Taipei is probably one of the greatest repositories of Chinese art, certainly anywhere in the world. Most of it, of course, hauled out of the mainland by the nationalists in 1949. Yeah, my view, as I say, the official position of the United States government, articulated from the Shanghai Communique in '72, later communiques, treaties, agreements, all this stuff, the official position of the United Nations and of 180 member countries of the United Nations is that there's only one China and Taiwan's part of China. The best thing, in my view, going forward, would be to let the situation muddle along the way it has for the last 73 years without trying to upset the apple cart. I think that the posturing and the rhetoric that comes out of Washington about this is very dangerous and very reckless. And I think that if anything is going to destabilize that situation, it's not going to happen in Beijing, and it's probably not going to happen in Taipei. It's going to happen down the road here. And I don't think that's a good thing. It is a very dangerous situation right now. There's a lot of provocations being carried out, and the scary part is, of course, that here in the United States, it's a bilateral initiative. I mean, Democrats, Republicans, they're competing with one another to see who can ratchet up the tensions over Taiwan to the greatest extent, and that's super dangerous. Anybody who thinks that, that Taiwan is somehow going to be defended by the United States is dreaming. I mean, I don't think we want, what is it, the USS Reagan, atomic aircraft carrier to get sunk by some Chinese cruise missile or something. So I think they're playing a very dangerous game. And I think it's largely being played for domestic political consumption here in the United States. And I think that it ignores the real interests of people on Taiwan and on the mainland, and really of everybody in this room, because I don't want to be incinerated any more than anybody else. Yeah. No, go ahead. You.
Okay. So I would say that during the previous administration, we saw a lot of horribly racist and anti-Chinese propaganda coming out of the Trump administration, specifically with the COVID virus and everything. And so I was wondering, because I feel like we heard a lot of things about, China is falsely reporting their COVID numbers, or like Chinese students who are peacefully protesting are being killed, and all of the, and the way that America sort of views the one-child rule as like an injustice and a breach on citizens' rights. So I guess I'm wondering your view on how much of that is is anti-Chinese propaganda being spread throughout the U.S., and then how much of that is actually injustices being performed on Chinese citizens by their government? Because we did just hear, I mean, someone brought up, like, during COVID, people were starving. Like, so I'm just wondering, on your perspective, how much of that is accurate, or how much of that is racist propaganda?
Yeah, boy, I wish I could quantify that. You pack a lot into that question. Certainly the Trump administration had a particular flair for rhetoric. Although the shift in attitude on the part of the American government really begins most clearly under Obama in 2011. But the whole pivot to Asia thing and the redeployment of our military assets. I think that, I mean, there's no question that especially under the previous administration, that a lot of the rhetoric, a lot of the characterizations, not only, you know, which were actually made, you know, on the part of national political leaders, but on the internet and other places. I mean, you know, we've seen this tremendous uptick in violence against people of Asian appearance, shall we say, you know, because most non-Asian Americans are not very capable of discriminating on a visual basis between who's from China, who's from Laos, who's from Japan, you know. So that's a very, very serious problem, and it has been exacerbated by the irresponsible rhetoric of American politicians on both sides of the aisle, you know. I think that it's very, very difficult for most of us in the West to gain access to a lot of direct information about what the realities are in China these days. Most folks don't speak Chinese, read Chinese, watch even English language Chinese television or anything like that. I mean, there's plenty of stuff going on, but most Americans don't have access to that. So, you know, there are a number of narratives that are out there, whether it's Tibet or Xinjiang or Taiwan or the South China Sea or, I don't know, just people in general. The idea that, I mean, you know, we hear this, we hear the terminology that Xi Jinping is a dictator and that China is an oppressive autocracy and that basically people are oppressed and, it's just, I mean, who the hell would want to go there, you know? I don't think that's, any of that is very close to reality. I mean, you know, China's a real place. It's not some abstract construct. It's not, you know, it's not perfect. It's not a worker's paradise. It's got tremendous problems and flaws. And Chinese people are just people. They're like anybody else, you know. So, you know, no one can just say, oh, no, you know, China's great. Everything they do is perfect. You know, no problem. But I think that, you know, religious issues, Tibet, Xinjiang, you bet there are tensions that exist within those societies. And I've been in both places a number of times. My perception, and again, it's my perception, is that traditional religions, Buddhism in Tibet, Islam in Xinjiang, do not have quite the same grip on the consciousness and attitudes of young people as they used to. I know more about Tibet than I do about Xinjiang. In Tibet, you know, the monasteries used to be the dominant infrastructure. I mean, it was a theocratic state, and until basically 1959, even after the revolution. And every family was expected to contribute a son to the monasteries, unless they only had one, you know. And the monasteries were dominant economically as well as politically. That, of course, is no longer the case. Ordinary people in Tibet, I mean, if you go to Lhasa or Shigatse, Gyantse, or other towns and stuff in the country, people are doing their Buddhist thing like crazy. You know, pilgrimage is still going on. You go to the Jokang in Lhasa, and people are doing their prostrations and their circumambulations and all this kind of stuff. There's no problem with that. You hear that you can't buy pictures of the Dalai Lama, but they sell them in the Barkor, the market right outside the Jokang. You know, so a lot of the stuff that we hear simply is not accurate. Young people in Tibet, I know you will all be shocked to hear the idea of something like this. They like their cell phones, and they like music, and they like wearing their Chicago or Villanova sweatshirts, you know. I mean, they are seduced by the realities of the modern world. I don't want to strike too close to home here, but you know, the Catholic Church in the United States faces a serious crisis these days because not so many young men want to become celibate priests, right? Well, duh, not so many young men want to go into the monasteries in Tibet, right? The monasteries are losing their influence. They have lost a lot of influence, and they fight back. It is a political situation, but it's not, you know, Chinese cultural genocide. It's the realities of the modern world. It's the seductions of the things that we're all seduced by, right? As I say, I don't know Xinjiang as well, but I've been there and I've talked to people, both Uyghurs and you know, other locals and Chinese as well. And yeah, there's tensions there. And again, the Islamic community leaders, they've lost a lot of influence. People want to be educated. They want to have jobs in the modern world, young people, you know. When people from Tibet or Xinjiang, ethnic minority people, go to universities in other parts of the country, we were just talking about this a little earlier. I know that I know the schools around Beijing best because I've taught there for many years, but those universities have halal dining halls, right? So that the Uyghur or Uzbek kids, you know, can eat their diets, right? That doesn't sound like a society that's dedicated to exterminating their culture, you know. Are there tensions? Yes. Are there separatist terrorists? You bet. I was living in Beijing when they blew up a bus on one of the big shopping streets. So, yeah, shit happens. And the Chinese government takes steps to try to, you know, prevent that and reduce that threat. And is that a perfect, seamless system? No, you know. But I think that much of what we hear about China is designed to foster attitudes of skepticism and fear. And, you know, I think that's unfortunate because it lowers the bar to the possible outbreak of serious conflict, which, as I was saying a little earlier, wouldn't be good for anybody on either side. It's 10 past.
Yeah, I think we have time for maybe one more question. If anybody...
Somebody over here had their hand up earlier.
Oh, I did,
Oh.
but that's awkward. All right, anyway, can you speak on the perceived, and you're just relating into it a little bit, the perceived genocide of Uyghur people from Americans, which until recently I didn't even know that was a thing that was up for debate because it's so cemented here in the
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, the use of the term genocide, I think, is horribly irresponsible. Genocide, has some very particular meanings, and to toss it around with that kind of casual political flippancy that we see so often certainly does a disservice to people who have been victims of genocide in the past, and it certainly totally ignores what we might think of as at least cultural genocide against the people who used to live right here. So there's problems on a number of levels with the use of the term. But the biggest problem is that it doesn't describe anything actual. As I say, there are contradictions in the situation in Xinjiang. There are separatist forces that would like to create an Islamic republic, and I think that we know that doesn't always work out really well for people like women, and that it can be a problem in a number of ways. All we have to do is take a gander at places like Afghanistan, and I think we can understand that may not be the best model. And the central government, the authorities in China, they're opposed to that. They don't want Xinjiang to be split away and turned into a fundamentalist Islamic state. So they're taking measures to try to avoid that outcome. Some of that is going to be a little, heavy-handed because you're dealing with people who blow up buses and stab people in bus stations, in large numbers and things like that. These incidents go on. I believe they don't represent the attitudes of the majority of people in Xinjiang. And as I say, especially many, many young people who, as I say, want to get educated, they want to get jobs, all that. But there are tensions, and there are ethnic tensions. I mean, Han Chinese and non-Han people who live in China sometimes rub up against each other the wrong way. Not always by any means. I mean, it's like any situation. But that can also be an issue. And there's, as I say, there's generational tensions. There's tensions over the interests of particular institutional structures. But to characterize what's going on as genocide or anything even vaguely approaching that is just, as I say, it's not in touch with reality. There's three principal sources that are cited repeatedly. All you got to do is read the media and just read to the end of the article. Don't just look at the headlines. There's three sources that are routinely cited about Xinjiang. One is a gentleman named Adrian Zenz, who is a visionary mystical Christian who works for an organization called the Foundation for the Victims of Communism. Okay, so it's not a particularly neutral academic institution. Another source is what's called ASDI, the Australian Strategic Defense Institute, which is funded by the American CIA, nicely located in Australia. And they are good headline grabbers. Most famously, a couple of years ago, they released a set of 685 photographs of sites of concentration camps in Xinjiang. Unfortunately, for them, people who were on the ground, documented the fact that most of those were schools or apartment complexes or hospitals or things like that. And the third source is basically the political organizations of the above ground political organizations of Islamic separatist groups in the country, and they have some headline speakers that appear before Congress and get quoted in the media and all this. Obviously, none of those are disinterested sources, right? Oftentimes, statements that are made are subsequently critiqued, or as they like to say, debunked. And sometimes that information even appears in the mainstream media, but it's usually on page 16 in a little box at the bottom of the corner of the page. The headlines are what matter, and those come overwhelmingly from those three sources. So, I am the last person to want to minimize the fact that there are these tensions. I mean, we look at history; it's full of tensions, and China today is no different. But it's not the way that it's described by Western politicians.
Yeah, my question is based on your experience in U.S. and China for so long time. How do you explain what's the difference between capitalism and socialism? What's the main aspect, like distinguish capitalism and socialism?
Well, I think the main difference is that here the ideal, or I suppose you could say even, is that if we let businesses pursue their private profits, that things will work out well for everybody, which is a problem. Whereas in China, at least on the sort of political culture level, I suppose, there's I think a stronger commitment to trying to at least meet people's basic needs. You know, and again, I return to these examples of the financial crisis and the COVID. I know that, I mean, geez, you know, trying to manage 1.4 billion people through the pandemic, I'm sure that there were serious problems. I mean, who the hell wants to be locked down? Nobody, right? And stuff, you know, was implemented, I know, from time to time in different places in problematic ways, and you know, it takes time to get systems up and running and everything. But I mean, just the mortality figures, it's a little different. Here, the priority was let's make profits for the pharmaceutical companies, the insurance companies, the hospital corporations, and boy, did they build tens of billions of dollars in profits. And we had, what do we got, 1.1 million people dead. In China, with all the contradictions, all the shortfalls, all the problems, you know, you just didn't have people dying on anything like the same scale. You know, and this idea of a people-centered development. I mean, obviously that's rhetoric and it's meant to have a certain appeal. But it sure does look different, you know. I mean, I'm not all that familiar with Philadelphia, but I know the cities that I spend the most time in here, Boston and San Francisco. You know, we have hundreds of thousands of people living on the streets when there are many, many more numbers than that of houses that are just sitting empty. You know, we cannot solve our basic needs here. You know, I mean, my state, New Mexico, you want to talk about cultural genocide, come visit me, you know. The condition of people on, you know, the reservations where people were, you know, shunted aside so that white folks could get rich. You know, it's pretty shocking sometimes. And life expectancy for indigenous people in the United States is 20 years less than for white folks. You know, I mean, it's remarkable. So, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, because I just came to U.S. like not very long. I see the homeless people, and then also see the drug problems, the gun shooting. That causes more death, right?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we got no shortage of problems.
Yeah. Also, back to the COVID period, the policy of the central government of Chinese, they changed, right? So it's not locked. So I was working in Shanghai in 2020. I was still working, so it's not everywhere is locked down. Mm-hmm. It's just where have the COVID.
Oh, no, absolutely,
like,
absolutely.
Like a specific community even.
Sure.
Specific apartment.
No, I know in
but the
Beijing.
starving problem is just happened this year in Shanghai, 2022, like few months.
Yeah.
So now they open up because I think it's the reaction to the situation, right? I mean, like they are trying to
adapt.
Adapt, find the best solution for specific situations. Yeah.
as you said, in the end, nothing is perfect, yeah. But like we should see what's the main difference, and then what's the government
Sure,
doing.
sure. Yeah, I mean, in dialectical materialism, we often talk about what's the primary contradiction, you know, because that shapes the way that we deal with secondary contradictions. Other questions and stuff? Well, you and then you.
So obviously after the dissolution of the USSR, the U.S. imperialism focused a lot on Middle Eastern countries, Iraq. What was it about that time period that didn't cause kind of U.S. imperialism or just Western imperialism in general to shift its focus onto China? And then what is kind of making it so that's being heightened now?
That's a very good question. You know, when the reform era gets underway, there was a hope, a faith even, on the part of many folks in Western capitalism that this really was, you know, as Chairman Mao used to say, people in positions of authority in the party taking the capitalist road, right? That China was just going to go lock, stock, and barrel and become a subordinate component of the global capitalist system with American capital at its hegemonic center, right? And in these debates that I mentioned in the 80s, they brought in these consultants, these American academics and economists and all this, with their advice about, you got to totally deregulate prices. You got to let it rip. If you're going to convert from socialism to like freedom. And fortunately, sober minds prevailed, although at certain points it was close. And so they didn't do that. And of course, when the Soviet Union went down, that's exactly what they did do. And the results of that were, problematic to say the least. But in the 90s, and even in the first decade of this century, Deng Xiaoping had counseled Jiang Zemin and others that for a period of time, what China had to do was bide its time and build its capacities, its capabilities. The idea being that, the whole point, it's reform and opening to the outside. The whole point of the opening was to draw in capital, foreign direct investment, to learn from the market mechanisms of the West, and incorporate and adapt those into China to do exactly what has happened, which is to grow the economy. The Chinese economy, on any measure now, is a lot different than it was 40 years ago. It's bigger, it's per capita consumption, all these different measures. Still, you take the Chinese economy and you compare it to the American economy on a per capita basis, it's still, a fraction, because there's 1.4 billion people there and 330 million people here. So economies of equal size on a per capita basis, it's very different. When Chinese production becomes as efficient, as productive as we are in the United States, and that's just the path on which things are going, China's economy will be 4 times the size of that of the United States. So for a while, the American and broader Western bourgeoisie dreamed and hoped that, as I say, China would become a subordinate component of the global capitalist system. That began to fall apart in the first decade of this century because China wasn't doing the things that they hoped it would do. No color revolution, no liberalization of the state. And China appeared to be being successful in its project of development. Yes, there was greater inequality, no question about it, but overall, livelihoods of a lot of people were improving. And it's one of those things where the bottom of that structure of inequality now is higher than the median was 50 years ago, you know? So as China was becoming more prosperous, and of course this really changes with Xi Jinping coming on the scene, it has also become more confident, less willing to bide its time while building its capacities. And so China has become more, pick your terminology, more assertive, more self-confident. It has begun to reclaim the kind of position in global affairs which the old China occupied for centuries. You know, a big economy, lots of trade, people coming there to look at how it works, you know. I mean, back in the 18th century, figures like Voltaire and Diderot in France in the Enlightenment, they looked to China for inspiration on good government and on prosperity in society, you know. A lot of the ideas, the reason that we have civil service exams to go work for the post office is because of the imperial state in China and their examinations for government service there. You know, China occupied this incredible position historically. That gets crushed by Western imperialism after the Industrial Revolution, and it's taken 2 centuries to get back to even beginning to be on that track again. But that's what's happening. There's a deep structural reconfiguration in global political economy taking place. American elites now flipped out, and it starts with Obama to pivot to Asia, it goes on with Trump, and Biden is the worst of them yet. They're desperate to stop China. They're desperate to thwart this process. And it's crazy, it's a fool's errand, but that's the thing. For a while, they convinced themselves that all they had to do was wait and China would go belly up, and then, you know, we would just pick the carcass. That's not happening. And so they're frustrated, they're pissed off, and they're out of control, you know, and the dangerous time.
Yeah, sure, thank you. And yeah, thank you so much for your talk. I'm thinking, and my question actually also in a way begins with like the Middle East. And just as someone who grew up during, like, one of my like first formative political experiences was like 9/11 and the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. It's something that just really, I think, inflected my experience a lot. I see a lot of the hatred and hatred that's being drummed up around Asian people, and the demonization of Chinese people, and, as you said, Asian appearing people. And I'm very saddened and concerned by it. And I guess one thing that I'm thinking about is that, of course, the viewpoints and the projects and the ideas of like a ruling elite in a government are never the same as those of the people. So I don't want to necessarily impugn like the average American person as being already on board with all of this kind of propaganda drive and so on. But it does certainly seem to be having an impact. I'm thinking also of like the TikTok hearings that are going on right now. Perhaps at the behest of Mark Zuckerberg's lobbying firm and so on. But I guess just to get, so that's a little bit of context, but to get to my question, it's sort of speculative in a way, but I'm wondering how you see the prospects of really like friendship and international cooperation between like American people and Chinese people, or America and the American government and the Chinese government in a way, or like what would have to change for that international cooperation and friendship to exist? Because I think it's so important and such a profound ideal to strive for, but at the same time it seems like a lot of like the material forces in society are cutting against that type of like internationalism from really taking root.
Yeah, no, that is a very dire situation, and and I'm afraid I can't be very sanguine about it looking forward. I mean, obviously, the last few years since with the pandemic and everything, travel back and forth has basically shut down. I mean, I first went to China in 1982 on a summer study program, and then the outfit that ran that hired me, and I stayed there for 5 years, bringing in American students, you know, and we brought in hundreds every year just for our program, and there were many other programs as well, and that went on and on and on and on and on, and you know, that was great. And I also, Karen mentioned, you know, I work from time to time with both National Geographic and the Smithsonian, taking groups to China and doing lectures and all that stuff there to try to introduce a little reality into American perceptions. But that hasn't been going on for a few years, and the American government has been working very hard to reduce knowledge and information about China other than what it chooses to disseminate. As Karen mentioned, I was the director of the Confucius Institute at New Mexico State. At one point, there were like 109 Confucius Institutes around the country. I don't know if you guys had one here or not, okay. But certainly, you know, there were some in Philly. And about 4 years ago, the State Department and the Defense Department went on a campaign where they told universities, especially publicly funded universities, that they certainly didn't want to interfere with academic freedom and our programs, but we could either continue to get $100,000 a year from China for the support of education in Chinese language, or we could continue to get $60 million a year from the Department of Defense for drone research. And the university, in its wisdom, decided that drones are better than knowing anything about China. So, you know, we went from 109 Confucius Institutes in the U.S. to, I think today there are maybe a dozen left. Because it's dangerous for the American elites, for people here to know the realities of China, you know. And again, not because China's so perfect that everybody's going to fall in love, but because it's not what they say, you know. And so I think it's going to be tough to get study abroad programs up and running, to get students going back to China. I think that there's fear. In fact, I've had conversations recently with people saying, would you really go back to China now? You know, won't you get arrested on the streets or something? And I was like, oh, come on, you know. But this relentless propaganda and demonization, it has an effect on people. You know, that's why it's so relentless. That's why, for God's sake, do we have to have the lab leak theory again? Come on, you know. I mean, it's just fear and hatred, you know. That's a great agenda from the perspective of those in power in this country, and it's bad. It's not good for us as ordinary people. Certainly not good for ordinary people in China. You know, the more exchange, the more knowledge, the more interaction there is, the better. But I think it's going to be a tough path to rebuild those kinds of contacts and connections in this period going forward. I'm glad you guys are here, because at least it's going one way, you know. How many Villanova students are studying in China right now?
I know a bunch. I had a student who was slated to go. It got canceled due to COVID.
Yeah.
But, you know,
Yeah.
Are those opportunities going to come back? I
don't know. I mean, visas are open again, you know. If you had a visa to go to China, you can reactivate it. If you want to apply for a new visa, you can do that. I know that some travel programs, like National Geographic, I know they're hoping to ramp up and start launching programs again in 2024. Whether people will sign up for those remains a question. I think that the atmosphere of fear and mistrust is so much worse than it used to be. So I don't know. This is an area where I'm not very optimistic. dinner time?
Jordan, did you have another?
I was going to ask something very similar to what you asked. So I suppose I have another question because I also come from New Mexico.
Whereabouts?
Albuquerque.
Oh, okay.
Your rival, the University of New Mexico. But we're here to squash rivalries.
That's right. That's right. Unite all those who can be united.
Exactly.
Exactly, okay.
The burning of the Aggie always made me uncomfortable. I don't know if you know they did that.
Oh, yeah.
So the context of my question has to do with indigenous liberation and socialism. And if any lessons can be drawn from the case of China, because I know that in the discourse of socialists talking about indigenous liberation, the idea of stages of history is very unwelcome, right? Because the idea is that if going from a situation of like an indigenous condition of life,
Yeah.
you want to proceed then to the stage of socialism, you have to go through the valley of shadows, right?
Yeah.
You have to go through the process of capitalist
Yeah.
alienation. So does the deep history of China give us reasons to think that the stagist theory is just false, or is it just more complicated than we thought, but ultimately at the end of the day, you do need socialism to be a transformation of commodity production?
Mm-hmm.
And again, what's in the background of this is, for those who have not already been, the very few people on earth who have not already been roped into commodity markets yet. And maybe it's a completely moot question already. I mean,
All 6 of them.
yeah, exactly. All 6 people in the Amazon who have not yet been completely destroyed by capitalism,
Yeah.
right? What hope is there for, yeah, anyhow.
I love a simple question. Well, I am, as you could probably tell, I'm not a big fan of the stages of history shit, I mean, there's no question. I mean, history moves along, and at different points in time, things look different, right? But I mean, what I'm really not a fan of is the sort of orthodoxy that gets articulated about the 1930s or so, short, the history of the Soviet Union, short course, the Stalin's writings on that stuff. I think that has done vastly more damage than benefit in the long run, and I'm actually writing a book about that, so keep your eyes on it. But there's that whole debate about Russia in towards the end of Marx's life, about whether the rural commune in Russia could be a way to skip the stage of history of capitalist development. Couldn't we take that commune, which is already a form of communal ownership and production and distribution, could we just take that and make that socialism? And Marx, who had been, as I say, Marx was very skeptical of peasants. But there's some letters where he's like, maybe, I mean, he doesn't come right flat out and say, oh yeah, no problem. But he's like, well, we should consider that. There's a recent book, Kevin Anderson, do you know? Is it Marx at the Margins or something? Yeah, that explores some of that stuff. So that would be, if you're interested, check that out a little. But this just gets into such deep stuff. The 20th century was kind of a detour, and Lenin knew it was a gamble going in, right? He was so banking on the workers of Western Europe. But after the collapse of the Second International, those guys, they were screwed, blued, and tattooed, I mean, they were just out of the picture, right? So you wound up with socialism in one country, and that was a tough row to hoe. Socialism isn't about scarcity, right? And building socialism from a foundation of the kind of scarcity that Russia faced in 1917, 1918, whoa. I mean, the things they accomplished are phenomenal. The historical experience of the Soviet Union and their ability to build was amazing. Filled with contradictions, filled with problems, some of the lessons of which were learned by China in the 50s. Collectivization there went very differently than it had in the Soviet experience. But still, building from such a low base with surrounded by hostile forces, and it was, of course, it was the competition with America that brought him down in the end. Reagan's new arms race nonsense. So really, where we should be building socialism is right here, because we already have advanced production and a highly educated working class, and et cetera, and et cetera. I mean, the conditions for socialism, if there's any place in the world that's ripe, it's the United States. We could make the transition tomorrow. But that's not how it's worked out historically, largely because of imperialism and because the struggles against imperialism were far-sighted enough, many of them, to embrace socialism and embrace Marxism. But then you find yourself in Cuba or in Venezuela or in, East Africa, trying to build a socialist state. And God knows, Cuba, probably the most successful socialist endeavor. But again, a socialism of poverty. Not because of problems of socialism, but because of the imperialist embargoes, So, I don't know. Certainly the template of stages that has been in place is not helpful. But charting a more down-to-earth trajectory of progression, I think, is a worthwhile endeavor. Does that go anywhere near answering your question?
Yeah, I mean, in the back of my mind, I've just got conversations I've had with people who said, well, what if we don't want development? And in my experience, there's actually very few indigenous people I've talked to of any sort who deny development altogether, but nevertheless, the idea that, like, what you're going to force people into, quote-unquote, modernization as socialists rather than as capitalists, but could be equally hostile to other modes of existence. Not my point of view necessarily, but it's just an argument.
No, I understand. And of course, again, if we look at the constant tension between what gets said and what gets done, there's a lot of theory that communal autonomy is a great thing. The creation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was not based upon the imposition of a centrally mandated uniform system. It was based upon, this confederation of communities that had their particular distinctive features. Obviously, there were problems along the way with that, as there is whenever plans meet reality. But that was the concept. And of course, ironically, when you turn that around, and we see this in China today as well, you have on the one hand, you have the museum approach. Let's take this traditional culture and isolate it, and let's keep those people like that, because tourists like to go watch them sing and dance, right? Or let's modernize, we're going to build a factory here, and you suckers can work in it, right? That's problematic too. So, I mean, as Marxists, as socialists, communists, whatever the hell we think of ourselves as being, we're about power for the people, This comrade just was saying to me in Chinese earlier that the most important thing that Chairman Mao said was serve the people, right? It's not about, and this was obviously the struggle between two lines, all that stuff. It's not about, we know what we're doing, you get with the program. It's about, how do we build this together? You wanna raise your sheep on the farm and not go to the big city and work in a factory? That should be fine. I'm totally down with that. Working that out in practice, and again, you're going to get into that generational thing. Why is Nebraska depopulating? Those ideals, those dreams of the rugged West and all that, they don't have as much traction. I mean, you're from Albuquerque.
Big city.
Big city, right, yeah. Yeah.
Hi, Professor. I'm Tina. I took your class on the China series of Tricontinental.
Oh, okay.
So
Yeah.
it's an honor every time. I graduated from Temple University, and when I was there, one of the professors, a Chinese professor, was raided by the FBI and accused of stealing secrets
Sure.
for the Chinese government. Years later, it turns out that was completely fabricated
Right.
by the state. So there's this like I guess already like the spying of like Chinese like researchers and educators, right, happening right now as we speak, as well as kind of just like the aggression, the violence that's like being taken out on everyday like regular people who are Asian, whether they're Chinese,
Right.
Vietnamese, etc. And so I guess my question is, what do you see as being kind of the immediate tasks in combating this, rise of violence against Asian people? Of course, not anything new, but also, in a highly like militarized, highly like in a I guess a society where there's so much like I guess surveillance happening by the U.S. government. How do you see us combating kind of the state repression that's happening?
Yeah. I mean, the thing with that's going beyond what I was saying earlier about the Confucius Institutes. There's also, of course, been this campaign at universities across the country of charging faculty members. Sometimes they're actually Chinese researchers who have come here on collaborative programs. That happened at MIT and in Tennessee and a few other places. Sometimes it's American citizens of Chinese ancestry. Sometimes it's even honkies working in collaboration with with Chinese scholars or programs affiliated with Chinese universities. The head of the chemistry department at Harvard, for example. And they have been targeted, and often, as you say, those cases fall apart. But again, they got the headlines, and they've made life hell for those people. And the goal is to intimidate, and again, to choke off exchanges of information and knowledge and collaboration across the Pacific. So that's a huge concern. How do we fight that and the other areas of that? I think that's a very uphill battle right now. I work with a group called Pivot to Peace out of San Francisco. That's their main thing, our main thing. Obviously, San Francisco, the Bay Area, is a huge area where that's a very, very concrete reality that has to be dealt with every day. I mean, the optimist side of me is like, well, we have to educate people, and we have to, push back whenever we can, and we have to try to point out that these anti-China policies of our government feed the racism and the hatred and the just ignorance that drives that kind of stuff. So that's what we do. We talk about it. We do our webinars. We write articles. We have to. You push your political program. How effective that will be, I think, is, as I was saying before, I think it's a very dangerous time, and it's a moment when we got to hunker down and keep the fight going. But it is I'm very I'm a little stressed about it all.
Me too.
Me too.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I'm getting hungry.
Thanks so much. Yeah.
Thank you. Great crowd. Jeez. I do this a lot at different schools. This is a nice bunch.
Yeah. Well, especially those who stuck around, right?
Oh yeah. Well, that's the plus crowd.
Yeah.